Hey guys! Tonight we travel back to a time when bread could chip your tooth, break your will, and possibly your jaw too. You're inside a longhouse now, smoke curling through the rafters, firelight flickering against thick wooden beams. The air smells like sweat, wet wool, and something vaguely burnt. That last part? Yeah, that's the bread. You blink slowly as your eyes adjust to the murky interior. A low, rhythmic murmur of voices surrounds you. Gruff, foreign, but not unfriendly. The fire crackles lazily, casting shadows that dance across fur-covered walls. Someone hands you a dense, uneven disc, charred on one side, slightly damp on the other, and suspiciously heavy. That's your dinner. Viking bread. Or, as some archaeologists now joke, prehistoric weaponry disguised as food. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me what time it is where you are and where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You raise the bread to your mouth. It's gritty, hard. You're not sure it qualifies as edible. You take a bite, regret it immediately. There's something sharp, like sand. No, not like sand. It is sand. Well, tiny rock particles anyway. And no, that's not an accident. Back in the Viking Age, roughly between the 8th and 11th centuries, the art of baking was, let's say, less Great British Bake Off and more Survivor Fjord Edition. They didn't have fancy mills or refined flour. What they did have were stone querns, two rough slabs used to grind barley, rye, and other grains into flour. But these stone surfaces, over time, wore down. Tiny fragments would chip off and blend into the flour. So, when you bit into a Viking loaf, you weren't just tasting the grain, you were getting a mouthful of ground stone too. That wasn't just bad for the flavor, it was terrible for your teeth. Archaeologists examining Viking skeletons have found alarming tooth wear, especially among older adults. Molars ground down like worn pebbles, gums inflamed, jawbones showing signs of infection. Still hungry? You chew slower this time, more carefully. The taste is earthy, slightly sour, almost bitter. There's no salt. Vikings didn't always have access to it. And no leavening either. Yeast was a luxury, and rising dough was a rare delight reserved for the rich or the lucky. You glance around the longhouse. Everyone's chewing. No one's complaining. For them, this bread is life. It fills the belly, gives strength, keeps you alive for the next voyage, raid, or freezing winter night. Some historians argue Viking bread wasn't always this bad. In coastal towns or trade hubs, you might find loaves a bit softer, baked with imported wheat or barley, maybe even sweetened with honey. But out here, in a rural farmstead deep in the Nordic wilds, bread is fuel, not flavor. Of course, not all scholars agree. Some suggest that the grittiness of Viking bread is exaggerated by archaeological findings. After all, most surviving samples are charred remnants from hearths or burial sites, already brittle, already distorted by time. Could it be that softer bread simply didn't survive the centuries? It's a valid point. But then again, when you're holding a palm-sized disc that feels like it could be used as a coaster or a throwing weapon, the argument seems moot. There's a saying among Viking reenactors, if it doesn't crack when you drop it, it's not authentic. You decide not to test that theory, mostly because your toes are cold and vulnerable right now. Someone passes a horn of mead. You sip. It helps. A little sweetness to chase the gravel down. Your throat thanks you. Outside, the wind howls through the mountains, and you realize why even a rock-hard bread could be a comfort. In a world where survival is measured in calories and courage, bread, even terrible bread, matters. You watch a child across the fire, gawing on her slice like it's the best thing ever made. Maybe it is, when you don't know better. Or maybe the warmth of shared food means more than the food itself. Still, your jaw aches. You imagine what Viking dentists would look like. Then you laugh softly, because there were no Viking dentists. If your teeth broke, that was it. Enjoy your soup. Tonight's story is just beginning. You haven't even touched on how bread shaped battle diets or what strange roles it played in Viking spirituality. But for now, you're just sitting in the smoke, staring at a loaf that might outlive civilization. Here's a fun little detail. Some Viking grave sites have turned up petrified bread loaves buried alongside the dead. You wake, or maybe you never quite slept, just drifted along the smoky warmth of that longhouse. The bread is still in your hand, slightly softer now with the heat of your palm, though not by much. You turn it over, examining the surface, uneven, rough, almost cratered. You're not sure whether it was baked or simply left too close to the fire until it stopped complaining. You're about to take another bite, brave soul that you are, when someone next to you mutters about the quernstone again. That ancient grinding device, that bread ruiner, that dental menace. So let's follow the flour trail for a bit. You head outside, crunching through frost-covered moss underfoot and into the workshed beside the house. Inside, there's the quern, two massive slabs of sandstone stacked like a prehistoric sandwich. A thick stick juts from the top stone, acting as a crank. A Viking woman, bare arms, rough apron, hair in tight braids, leans over it, grinding grain with slow, practiced strength. The sound is steady, like low thunder muffled by wool. Grain goes in, dusty flour comes out. Well, flour is generous. It's coarse, almost gritty like beach sand. It sticks to your fingers. It smells musty and warm. And it sparkles faintly in the sunlight coming through the door. That sparkle? Not fairy dust, tiny shards of stone. You try not to breathe it in. And as you watch her pour another scoop of barley into the quern, you begin to understand how the bread ended up tasting like a mouthful of gravel. Barley was the grain of choice, hardy, resistant to frost, willing to grow in unforgiving soils. But it wasn't exactly a baking superstar. It lacks gluten, the magical protein that gives bread its fluff and bounce. So, even without the stone dust, Viking bread would still be dense, flat, heavy. They sometimes mixed it with other grains, oats, rye, even wild seeds, whatever they had on hand. Bread wasn't a culinary decision, it was survival in disc form. Some historians argue that not every Viking household used querns that produced stone fragments. There's a theory that wealthier families or communities near river mills had access to better grinding tools, water-powered wheels that produced finer flour. But again, that might be romanticizing things. Most people weren't rich. Most people weren't near mills. Most people had sore jaws. And even the best cornstones wore down over time. You imagine it now. Week after week, year after year, grain grinding down stone as stone ground down grain. A slow, mutual destruction. It's not all doom and dental decay, though. There's something beautiful in the rhythm, the circular motion of the grindstone, the flow of flour into the bowl, the scent of effort, of sustenance being earned the hard way. Someone taps your shoulder, hands you a warm, fresh piece of dough, not yet baked. It's sticky. You knead it between your palms, unsure whether it's a privilege or a punishment. The dough sticks to your fingers like clay. You hear them say something in Old Norse. You don't understand the words, but you get the meaning. Go ahead, bake it yourself. So you do. You walk back toward the hearth. You flatten the dough into a lumpy disc and toss it onto a hot stone near the fire. It hisses, sizzles, smells faintly like regret and ambition. And there it is, the Viking bread-making experience. You grind it with stone, you knead it with cold fingers, you bake it on an uneven slab of rock, and then you chew it until your molars beg for mercy. One odd little historical tidbit: Viking children apparently chewed pieces of bread into animal shapes, dogs, horses, even dragons. Then they dried them near the fire until they hardened into little biscuit figurines. Archaeologists have found these fossilized bread toys buried beneath floors and hearths, strange, edible sculptures from a forgotten childhood. Bread wasn't just food. It was part of life, play, ritual, even storytelling. As you poke at your half-baked creation, someone leans over and gives a faint smile, only a few teeth missing. They mutter something approving and flip it with a knife. It's burned on one side, raw on the other. Still counts. Some say the Vikings viewed bread as a bridge between earth and spirit. Grain came from the ground, but baking transformed it through fire, a kind of alchemy. It wasn't uncommon for families to leave bread out overnight, a gesture to household spirits or wandering ancestors. Just a bite, a crumb, a symbolic meal. Other scholars push back, arguing, "You don't quite remember when the laughter died down. The longhouse is quieter now, just the soft hum of wind pressing against the timber walls and the occasional creak of someone turning in their sleep. But you're still awake, still chewing, technically. The bread hasn't left your jaw alone for the last 15 minutes. You're pretty sure it has opinions about your dental hygiene." You glance over at a younger Viking, barely 16 winters old by your guess, kneeling beside a wooden chest, lacing his leather boots with a practiced hand. His name is Halldor. You heard it once, muttered over a bowl of broth. He's heading out at first light on a supply run, or maybe a raid. The line between the two is blurry. You watch as he tucks a bundle into his belt, a pouch of dried fish, a folded-up piece of cloth, and, yes, a hard slab of bread. Not fresh, not warm, not even close. This is travel bread. Darker, denser, tougher than what you chewed earlier, which is honestly kind of impressive. This is when it hits you. Viking bread wasn't just breakfast. It was battlefield rations. Portable, durable, and, most importantly, calorie-dense. You rise slowly, stretching limbs that feel heavier in this colder timeline, and follow him outside. The pre-dawn light is dim, casting the landscape in a gray-blue wash. Frost clings to the grass. Your breath curls like smoke in front of you. Halldor squats by the fire pit, wrapping his slab of bread in cloth and tucking it into his satchel like it's a precious object. And maybe it is. Out there, beyond the village's edge, food doesn't wait for you. You bring it or you go hungry. The Viking diet was high in fat and protein when they could manage it. Seal meat, whale blubber, fish, and fermented dairy. But bread was the backbone. It filled the gaps, gave weight to a meal, soaked up broth, lined the belly before ale, and when necessary, doubled as a shield from hunger. You've probably heard the myth that Vikings were all about meat, roasting entire beasts on spits, axes in one hand and mugs in the other. That's mostly legend. The reality? Bread was far more common at a raider's table than roast boar. And the bread had to last. Which explains why it was often baked until it was practically fossilized. Fresh bread went stale quickly in the damp Nordic climate. Hard bread? It could last weeks, even months. Just needed a little mead or soup to soften it before eating. You try to imagine crossing icy fjords with nothing but dried cod and brick loaf bread in your pack. No chocolate, no granola bars, no hot lattes. Respect. There's a particular flatbread called knäckebröd that shows up later in Scandinavian history. Modern versions are crisp, airy, kind of addictive. Viking precursors were not. Think if a roof shingle had feelings. And yet, these heavy unleavened discs were beloved for their simplicity. Easy to make, hard to spoil. If they didn't get eaten, they'd be fed to animals. If animals didn't want them, well, you could always patch a wall with one. As you trail Halldor toward the forest line, Someone else joins him, an older man, scarred, limping slightly, carrying a satchel of his own. They greet each other with a grunt and a nod, no words needed. But when they walk, you notice something odd. They chew, slowly, in rhythm, not talking, just chewing. You realize they're preloading energy for the road. Bread as breakfast, bread as momentum. The act of chewing itself is almost meditative, a ritual. Modern soldiers eat MREs, sealed engineered meals with calorie counts printed on the side. Vikings had bread they baked with their own hands, knowing exactly how tough it would be when they needed it most. Historians often argue about the significance of bread in a Viking's gear. Was it truly central, or was dried fish the real hero? Some suggest warriors carried hard bread specifically made for journeys, while others believe most food was found or stolen en route. The truth is likely somewhere in between. You find it strange how intimate that is. Breaking off a piece of the same bread your grandfather chewed, your mother baked, your gods maybe even watched you drop into a fire. And there's a tiny, strange story you overhear later that night. A quiet voice saying, "Oler left no crumbs." It's a saying, apparently, meant to mean he was precise.
You blink, and suddenly it's late morning or early afternoon. Time has slipped again. Maybe the fire lulled you, or maybe you've just grown used to the way the light changes differently in these northern lands. Either way, you're still here, still among the soft creak of timber beams and the slow rustle of furs being moved aside. A new loaf sits near the hearth, this one darker, flatter, more experimental. You can smell the difference. There's a faint tang, like wet hay and vinegar. Someone leavened it badly. Which brings us to the next step in your carb-filled journey, fermentation. You crouch next to the loaf, poke it. It barely gives. There's an unmistakable smell of sourness, but not quite the inviting tang of modern sourdough. More like, guess we'll eat it anyway vibes. See, while Viking bread was typically unleavened, flat and heavy, there are accounts, scattered and debatable, of fermentation techniques being used. The wild yeast in the air, mixed with warmth and thyme, could cause dough to rise, just a little, just enough to create air bubbles, a lighter texture, or at least a less jaw-breaking experience. But fermentation isn't always kind. If you get the wrong kind of bacteria, you don't get bread, you get regret. You ask the woman tending the hearth, an older Viking with a wide, flat nose and a braided beard so subtle it almost looks accidental, how they manage the souring process. She shrugs and points to a cloth-covered bowl near the fire. You peek under the cloth. Inside is a bubbling, pale mass. It smells alive. Fermentation in its earliest, rawest form. Some speculate that the Vikings developed crude sourdough starters by accident, a bowl of forgotten dough left near the hearth, catching yeast from the air and bubbling into something new. Others argue that this knowledge came from contact with other cultures, through trade, through raids, through exposure to more sophisticated baking practices. Either way, the end result was variable. You're offered a slice of the experimental loaf. It's warm, at least. You tear a corner off. It resists, but not entirely. You bite. And hey, it's not bad. A little tangy, still heavy, still dense, but with just enough lift to feel like bread and not punishment. You compliment the baker. She grins, revealing a toothless upper row. You don't know if that's a warning or just age. Here's something wild. Some bread wasn't meant to be eaten at all. Archaeological digs have unearthed what appear to be bread offerings buried in ritual pits. These weren't burned, nor buried with people, but set into the earth alone. Symbolic, sacrificial. The dough was often mixed with herbs, some sacred, some hallucinogenic, and pressed into specific shapes. Not always round, sometimes faces, sometimes animals, always purposeful. Was this Viking sourdough magic,
or just a deeply bored baker trying to impress their gods? Academics debate this endlessly. Some say it points to an early animistic spirituality, grain and yeast as living spirits transforming through fire. Others argue it was purely practical, bread as biodegradable currency, something you could offer to the earth without offending the gods or attracting wild animals. And then there's the strangest angle of all. Some believe the Vikings might have believed their bread could hear. Old Norse proverbs whisper about quiet hands when baking and not cursing the dough. There's this idea that the bread would rise better if the baker was calm, silent, intentional, as if the dough had ears or feelings. Imagine that. Emotional bread, sentient carbs, your sourdough starter judging your mood. You stare at the experimental loaf. It stares back. It's probably fine. You go outside to clear your head. The village is alive now, chickens underfoot, smoke rising from other hearths, children running past with chunks of what might be bread or just tightly packed mud. You can't tell. It's that kind of morning. There's a man sitting on an overturned barrel carving runes into a flat piece of bark. You watch him for a while. He pauses, looks up. "You hungry?" he asks. You hesitate. "Are you?" He reaches into a cloth pouch and hands you a small, circular bread. It's thin, brittle, almost like a cracker. "Journey bread," he says. You crack it in half. It splits with a satisfying snap. The inside is pale and dry, but there's a softness to the smell, faint herbs, maybe some crushed juniper. You chew slowly. He tells you it's for protection, not magically, practically. Eat before you go, keeps the hunger quiet, tells the body to wait. You wake again, though you don't remember falling asleep. There's a smear of ash on your cheek and a crust of something hard wedged against your side. It's the experimental bread from earlier, flattened now, like it tried to make a pillow of itself and failed, heroically. Someone's cooking outside. The scent of onions, or Viking onions, which are more like angry shallots, and some kind of bubbling stew draws you from your seat. You step out into the soft drizzle of midday rain, where the fire's been coaxed into roaring beneath a hanging cauldron. The bread, of course, is right beside it, stacked, waiting, enduring. And it's here that you encounter a strange custom: bread bowls. Yes, Viking style. You watch as a woman ladles stew into a hollowed-out chunk of rye bread, its sides blackened from the hearth. The crust is hard enough to withstand liquid, at least for a while. The idea is simple: eat the stew, then eat the bowl. No dishes, no cleanup, just dissolve your plate with your mouth. It's shockingly clever and sustainable, and slightly medievally metal. The bread bowls are rarely perfect, more like saggy bricks than neat domes, but they do the job. And the stew softens the interior just enough that biting into it doesn't feel like a dental emergency. You're handed one. Of course you are. The stew is surprisingly good, thick with barley, root vegetables, and strips of dried meat revived in broth. And as the liquid seeps into the crust, the bread becomes edible. Not delightful, but edible. And that's the thing. Viking bread was never trying to be delightful. It was trying to not fail, to survive the fire, to survive time, to be there when you needed it. There's a tale being told beside you, a boy reciting a story he's clearly memorized from someone older. It's about a man who tricked a troll by giving him a loaf of bread so hard, the troll's teeth shattered. The troll ran screaming into the sea, defeated by carbs. You think about that while chewing. You're not saying this bread could be used as a weapon, but you wouldn't be surprised if it came with a body count. And the detail that really gets you: bread wasn't just a side dish in these stories. It was a character, a tool, a solution. There's another story, older and more whispered, of a Viking woman who made a loaf so perfectly balanced that it never molded. It traveled across 9 kingdoms. It fed gods and mortals alike. The loaf was eventually buried under a mountain to keep it safe, or maybe because no one could bite through it. Academic interpretations of these tales vary. Was the bread symbolic of stability? Was it a metaphor for tradition? Or was it just an old story about the time someone made a really impressive loaf? No one agrees. In fact, some scholars still argue whether Vikings even had the infrastructure to create consistent bread at all. With no central bakeries, no industrial mills, everything was household-based. Each family's bread would have tasted and felt different, depending on the region, the ingredients, even the shape of the hearth. Imagine going to a neighboring village and biting into their bread only to recoil and say, "What is that?" And they say, "It's fennel and birch ash for texture." And then you have to pretend not to cry. You finish your bread bowl, or what remains of it. The soggy crust folds in on itself like a tired hat. It's weirdly satisfying. Someone offers you a drink. It's thin beer, barely fermented, more like barley tea, but you take it. It washes down the last of the crust, which was threatening to re-harden mid-swallow. As you sit by the fire, warmed and vaguely full, you notice something odd. The bread here has markings on it. Not decorative, not random, symbols, carved into the top before baking. One is a spiral, another 3 dots in a triangle. One loaf even has what looks like runes. You glance around, hoping someone will explain, and sure enough, an elder sitting nearby takes a bite of her marked bread and speaks. "Protection," she says, mouth full. "This one keeps the cold away. That one keeps spirits off the doorstep. That one makes husbands faithful." You raise an eyebrow. She grams, shrugs, and adds, "Not always." Turns out, this is an actual thing, bread as talisman. The shapes carved into dough were believed to infuse it with intention. Not quite magic, not quite prayer, something in between. A spiritual snack, if you will. Some loaves were left unbaked on purpose, buried near homes to ward off hunger spirits. Others were baked and shared at feasts to bring good luck for the harvest. Bread wasn't just food, it was a message. And the message was, "We are still here." The thought lingers with you as the fire dies down again and people drift back.
You're sitting on a low stool now, your back warm from a freshly stoked hearth, watching a pair of hands knead dough with the kind of determination that suggests revenge more than baking. The dough squelches and folds and sticks, protesting like an old man being asked to dance. This is no ordinary bread session. This is winter prep, a ritual, a trial, a chance for the Vikings to prove that they could store calories with the same ferocity they stored weapons. Winter bread, as you now discover, is a different beast altogether. The ingredients shift subtly. More bark flour, less grain. Less leavening, more brute force. It's baked in large batches, dried until it resembles stone, and then tucked into storage spaces so cold they make modern freezers feel tropical. You're handed a finished slice. It's thin, dark, and vaguely translucent. You bite. It doesn't break. It cracks, loudly, like you've stepped on ancient ice. The woman beside you, her sleeves dusted with flour and pride, laughs softly. Good bread breaks teeth. You nod solemnly. Of course it does. But this bread isn't meant to be pleasant. It's meant to last. Through months of snow and ice. Through storms and sickness. A bread you could lose behind a barrel and find again in spring. Still edible. Still technically bread. This style of baking reveals one of the strangest truths about Viking food culture. Preservation was paramount. Flavor was secondary. Texture, optional. There's a peculiar technique you're shown next. After baking, some loaves are hung from the rafters. Yes, hung. Threaded through with rope or twine and suspended like culinary wind chimes. They dry, they harden, and they stay there until needed. You imagine waking up to a blizzard, reaching up into the dark, and snapping off a slice of rope-dried rye with a casual thunk. It's absurd. It's beautiful. It's efficient. And it gets stranger. Some winter loaves weren't just for eating.
They doubled as measuring tools. You're not kidding. Certain households made flat, circular loaves of standardized width, then used them to gauge storage. Stack 10 loaves high in a barrel, that's how much barley flour you used, or how much honey you'll need to flavor the next batch. Bread as calculator. There's archaeological evidence for this too. Uneven stacks of carbonized bread rounds found in cellars, some still bearing impressions of tally marks or even household symbols. But was this common? That's the part no one agrees on. Some historians argue it was rare, a clever quirk from a particular region. Others believe it was widespread and simply underdocumented. After all, no one wrote down how their pantry math worked, not when raids and snowstorms were more immediate concerns. You run your fingers along the surface of one such measuring loaf. It's rigid, almost glossy with age. The marks are clear. 4 vertical slashes and a notch. Could mean anything, could mean everything. Nearby, a man demonstrates a different winter bread. Flat bread with holes. You blink. Like Swiss bread? He doesn't understand you, but nods anyway. These loaves are deliberately baked with small holes in the middle, not for decoration, but for function. They're hung on long poles like edible laundry, up high near the smoke. They dry, they flavor smoke-cured carbohydrates. It's almost poetic, almost gourmet. And here's the best part. These holy loaves sometimes doubled as plates. You'd tear food with your hands and place it on the flatbread, letting meat juices soak in. Then you'd eat the bread after. A full circle of Viking efficiency, one object, 2 uses, minimal dishes. Modern Viking reenactors have tried this method at festivals. Reviews are mixed. Some call it rustic genius. Others say it tastes like barbecue on an old coaster. You watch a child gnaw on one of the hanging breads. She grins through the crust flakes, clearly pleased with herself. Her father nods approvingly and mutters something about strong jaws, strong heart. You believe him. And amidst all this, you realize something unexpected. Viking bread wasn't just food. It was infrastructure. It filled the role of shelf-stable rations, measuring tools, ceremonial offerings, even cultural shorthand. A non-verbal language of crust and shape and smoke. And what's more, bread was status. A family with enough grain to bake extra loaves, wealthy. A home with hanging racks of perfectly dried flatbreads, prepared.
You awaken to the sound of something crisp snapping beneath your head. It's bread again, always bread. You're starting to suspect you spent more time using it as a pillow than as food. Still, you're not mad about it. There's a strange comfort in being surrounded by loaves tough enough to survive a siege. Outside, the wind howls against the wooden walls of the hall, but inside, things are oddly festive. Today is a feast day, or maybe a funeral, or both. It's hard to tell, honestly, because the Vikings didn't always separate celebration from mourning. They had a way of folding one emotion into another, like dough twisted into itself. And naturally, bread played a part in that too. You're ushered toward a long table, rough-hewn and crowded with people. On it lies a large loaf, shaped not round, not flat, but twisted. Intricately braided, dark from honey and soot, and dusted with something pale and fragrant. Birch ash, someone says. This is ritual bread, sacred, symbolic, rarely eaten, often buried. One woman leans close to you and whispers, "This one's for the gods." You nod, trying not to appear too mortal. This braided bread is part of a larger tradition. Offerings made from grain were common in Viking ritual, especially in ceremonies tied to the harvest, marriage, death, or seasonal changes. These weren't casual snacks. They were meant to communicate, to seal a pact, to appease. In some regions, loaves were baked in the shape of sun wheels. Others were formed into animal figures, goats, birds, even dragons. Not realistic, mind you. These weren't Viking cake decorators, but symbolic.
A burnt lump that vaguely resembled a horse still counted as long as the intention was clear. You learn that after large rituals, parts of these loaves might be buried in the soil to feed the earth, or offered in streams for the spirits. A piece might be tucked under a house beam or left at the edge of the forest with a smear of butter. And yes, some pieces were eaten, slowly, reverently, like chewing your way through a prayer. It's debated whether these ritual loaves had specific recipes. Some scholars argue they were just regular bread made with extra care. Others believe there were distinct ingredients, wild herbs, sacred grains, animal fats reserved only for rites, maybe even blood. Although let's not dwell on that part. You're trying to keep things PG-13 here. You take a bite from a simpler loaf, handed down the table. It's slightly sweet, fennel and honey, softer than you expected, probably the closest thing you've had to cake this entire journey. And yet, not cake, still stubborn, still gritty. A man across from you tells a story, half truth, half myth, about a loaf baked during an eclipse. He says it cracked down the middle, perfectly in line with the moon's shadow. Everyone swore it was a sign. Of what? No one's sure. But the bread was never eaten. It was dried, wrapped in wool, and kept in a box carved with runes. It's still around, apparently, somewhere, waiting for another eclipse. You make a mental note not to eat mysterious eclipse bread, just in case. As the evening deepens, music begins. Low strings, clapping, voices rising like smoke. Children run between benches. Elders drink from wide, shallow cups. You feel warmth seep into your bones, not from the fire, but from the feeling that you are part of something ancient, something rough and reverent. A culture that treated bread not as background noise, but a medium, a language of yeast and ash. You remember something you were told earlier about loaves being named. Named. Apparently, a family might have a ceremonial bread known as the first, or the bitter, or the guest, passed down like heirlooms, baked only once a year, or once in a generation. One old woman even claims her great-grandmother's wedding loaf is still stored in a wooden box under the floor. It hasn't molded, she says proudly. You believe her. You also never want to open that box. The symbolic power of these breads still lingers in some Nordic traditions today. In parts of Scandinavia, braided loaves are still served at weddings, decorated with seeds that each hold meaning, fertility, luck, long life. It's not hard to trace those customs back, loaf by loaf, to fires like the one you sit by now. Someone slices the twisted bread, finally. Only the outer pieces are eaten. The center is too dense, too meaningful. It's placed gently on a small wooden plate and passed to the family of the deceased, or maybe the couple getting married.
You wake to a muffled clatter. Something just fell off a rafter. Judging by the thunk and the small cloud of flour dust drifting lazily through the air, it was probably, yes, another loaf, a bread casualty. Happens to the best of them. You're in a different space now, smaller, dimmer. The air is thicker with smoke and salt, and there's a sharp tang in your nose that suggests fermentation or possibly disappointment. Welcome to the Viking ship kitchen, which is to say, a corner of the boat where someone desperately tries to turn soaked oats and dried fish into something vaguely edible without catching the whole vessel on fire. Here, bread changes again. On land, the Vikings had ovens, stones, time. At sea, not so much. Baking bread during long voyages was less a culinary art and more a gamble between starvation and food poisoning. Instead of baking, seafaring Vikings relied heavily on hardtack, the kind of bread that makes you question whether your teeth are a temporary feature. It's dry, thin, usually unsalted, and often stored in layers wrapped in waxed cloth or stuffed into barrels lined with tar. You pick up a piece. It has all the give of a medieval roof tile. Someone tells you this batch is only a month old, which is basically fresh in hardtack years. You bite into it, immediately regret it. Still, it's not about the flavor, it's about function. These little slabs could survive months at sea. They didn't mold, didn't rot, they just waited for a chance to be eaten or used to stop a leak or thrown at seagulls. Multi-purpose. One sailor demonstrates the standard practice: dunk the hardtack into broth or ale until it softens just enough to not chip enamel. You watch it slowly absorb liquid, the surface bubbling like it's returning to life. Kind of. Others preferred to crumble it into stew or even soak it overnight in milk with dried berries to create a kind of breakfast porridge/punishment. But again, there's nuance. Some archaeologists suggest that Viking sailors may have carried sweetened shipbread, especially for longer or more prestigious voyages. These were made with honey or dried fruit mixed in, caloric, yes, but also morale boosters. A rare treat to break the monotony of dried fish and brined sadness. There's debate though. Some scholars argue that the honey fruit shipbread is more myth than fact, a product of later romanticism rather than historical reality. Others point to certain burial sites where fragments of what appears to be sweetened dough were found near nautical artifacts. Maybe it was a funeral rite, maybe it was someone's secret stash. Either way, you'd take it. There's another weird twist: bread as currency. In certain coastal settlements, especially those tied to trade routes, specific bread types could be used in bartering. Not officially, like coins, but practically. A sailor with extra dried loaves might trade them for labor, shelter, or fermented shark, which honestly seems like a downgrade. You're shown a ledger, well, a slate with markings, where someone had tallied loaves against services. 3 for sharpening, 5 for mending sail. It's speculative, yes, but plausible. When your bread lasts longer than your tunic, it becomes more than food. It's value. One grizzled old man tells you his grandfather's grandfather's grandfather once paid for a ferry ride with bread. Still warm, he adds with a wink, which is why it was such a good deal. At this point, you can't tell if he's joking. You hope he is. You're invited to sit on a low plank and eat with the crew. The menu? Dried fish, cabbage that may have started its own religion, and, of course, bread, crumbled into everything. A crunchy layer of reassurance. As you chew through the meal, you begin to notice something. The way the crew watches the bread, how they divide it, how the last piece is saved, not eaten immediately, but tucked away. You ask about it. It's the anchor, one sailor says simply, in case everything else goes wrong. It's a superstition, one shared by many Viking crews. The final piece of bread, the anchor loaf, was never eaten unless it was truly the end. Symbolically, it held the voyage together, a promise of return. There are even stories, half myth, half memory, of ships found wrecked, cargo gone, crew lost, but with a single loaf still intact, preserved in oilcloth, waiting. You glance at the remaining piece on the table. It does look oddly noble. Another sailor, younger and more pragmatic, tells you they always pack extra just to have one untouched. We call it the ghost loaf, he adds with a grin.
By now, you've chewed your way through what feels like half of Scandinavia. Your jaw is stronger, your soul arguably wiser, and your digestive system, let's just say, it's seen some things. But tonight, you're somewhere completely different. You sit in a dim longhouse, not as a visitor, but as part of the rhythm now. The table before you isn't just laid with food, it's layered with memory. People speak in low tones, passing loaves as if they're stories, breaking pieces with a kind of reverence that feels deeply human. Tonight is story bread night. It's not a formal tradition exactly, but in this particular village, it's how histories are passed down. Bread becomes the backdrop for remembrance, for tales too odd or personal to make it into sagas. You're handed a small round loaf, crusted with herbs and dusted with something sharp, likely vinegar flour. And as you chew, someone begins to speak. The first story is about a man who baked a single loaf every year for his lost wife, carving her name into the crust before letting it turn to stone in the pantry. "There are 23 now," says the old woman telling the tale, "lined up like sentries." Another tale comes from across the room. A failed harvest when only one barley loaf was made, and it was shared between 30 mouths. "We didn't even chew," the man says, "we just tasted the air around it." You'd laugh, but no one else does. Because that's the thing. These breads are sacred, not solemn. They hold joy, grief, absurdity. One boy shares that he once tried to bake bread in the forge, thinking it would cook faster. It didn't. "It exploded," he says proudly, as if creating artisanal shrapnel is a rite of passage. It is, apparently. You're shown a loaf shaped like a bird, slightly charred, one wing lopsided. It's meant to be an offering for a wedding, the bird representing the journey of love. "They divorced after 6 weeks," someone whispers, "but the bread is still good." There's a toast to the bread, not the marriage. As the stories continue, you realize that Viking bread is as much a diary as it is a dish. Every scorched crust, every odd shape or missing corner is a record, a laugh, a lesson. And it wasn't just humans who got in on the act. In one corner of the room, you find a small bundle, cloth-wrapped, carefully stored. It's dog bread. Yes, bread made for dogs. Not as some fluffy modern pet treat, but as part of working life. High in fat, often mixed with fish meal, and baked into bone-shaped slabs. Some dogs were buried with a final loaf at their side, because even a warhound deserves a last bite. Not surprisingly, scholars disagree about this. Some say the dog bread was just discarded human food. Others argue that bones found alongside bread remains in canine graves suggest intentional preparation, maybe even love. Either way, you suddenly want to pet every Viking dog that ever lived. The room quiets, and an elder speaks. His voice is low, broken like cracked rye, but clear. He tells the tale of a bread burial. A woman lost in childbirth, honored with a loaf baked by her sister. It contained herbs, sweet gale, meadowsweet, and yarrow. Not for flavor, but for meaning, protection, farewell. The loaf was buried with her, whole. Years later, when the sister died, a similar loaf was placed beside hers. No one had ever tasted either. You feel that one settle in your chest like a warm stone. The elder smiles at you. "We bury what we can't eat," he says. "We eat what we don't want to forget." There's one more loaf passed around, strange and long, and etched with lines like tally marks. Someone explains it was baked during a famine when each cut in the dough marked a day without meat. They baked it anyway. Ritual, habit, hope. The loaf is still whole. And just when you think this moment can't get any heavier, someone hands you a spoon. You stare at it. It's wooden, carved from pine, worn smooth from generations of fingers. The handle is shaped like a tiny bread peel. You're told it's the last loaf spoon, used only when the final piece of communal bread is served. It's not about scooping, it's about the symbolism. One last touch, a reminder that this meal, like all things, must end. You hold it carefully. It's absurd, really, to be moved by cutlery, but here, with smoke in your hair and crumbs on your lap, it's a relic, a whisper, a weight. Around you, the longhouse fades into quiet. People lean on each other. Embers crack.
The fire's burned low now, just a rim of amber clinging to the logs. You sit back, legs stretched, arms heavy, with the warm drowse of barley and wood smoke soaking into your bones. Outside, the snow sighs against the longhouse. Inside, it's only breath and the slow cooling of stones. You're offered one final piece of bread, small, soft, and unfamiliar. You press a thumb into the center. It springs back gently. A hint of sweetness on the air. It smells modern, almost. It's time to leave the Viking world behind, but the journey isn't quite over. You close your eyes, and the bread changes shape in your hand. Not by magic, just by time. You drift forward across centuries, through soot and famine and butter churns, until you land in a place of strange contradictions. Welcome to the Viking bread revival. It's the 21st century now. You're standing in a Danish bakery built from stone and glass, full of smiling tourists and earnest bakers wearing vintage aprons, ironically. The loaves on display are rustic, gorgeous even. Sunflower seed crusts, black rye ridges, golden barley braids. Labels say things like authentic, traditional, and Viking-inspired. You resist the urge to laugh. Because here's the twist. Nobody really knows what Viking bread tasted like. We can guess, reconstruct, simulate, but the actual flavor, the texture, the sound it made when broken in half by calloused hands, those are gone. Bread doesn't fossilize, it just disappears. Modern efforts to recreate it are fascinating though. Some bakeries use flour from ancient grains, emmer, spelt, inkhorn. They mix in juniper ash or sea salt. Some go full experimental archaeology and bake loaves on stones over open flame, wrapped in cabbage leaves or buried under coals. Others just add a lot of seeds and call it a day. There's even a cafe in Norway where you can eat Viking toast, which is just flatbread with pickled herring and enough dill to launch a rebellion. You take a bite. It's okay, a little chewy, definitely edible, but does it feel ancient? Does it feel like a story? That's the thing. Modern Viking bread is more about longing than accuracy. A hunger for connection, a way to taste the past, however vaguely, to imagine a world where food was sacred and survival was steeped into the dough. Even museums get in on it, hosting baking workshops where kids grind flour on replica quernstones and shape little lumps of dense rye. Some of them burn their loaves, others drop them in the fire. One girl makes hers into the shape of a dragon. You approve. There's a small exhibit tucked in the back. Under glass sits a blackened puck of bread excavated from a centuries-old hearth site. It's barely more than a crust, charred, cracked, crumbling, but somehow it holds the attention of everyone who passes. Because it's real. You look closer. There are seeds pressed into it, a few grains still clinging to the edge, and a tiny indentation, maybe from a thumb, maybe from a tool, maybe from time. You suddenly understand why people bake bread they can't pronounce, with ingredients they had to order from obscure online farms, in ovens they made themselves out of clay and regret. It's not about taste, it's about contact. Because to touch what someone else touched across 1,000 years, to shape the same dough, under the same moon, in the same basic shape, that's magic. You return to the longhouse in your mind, where the final crumb has been shared and the coals fade like old stories. There's one more thing, a superstition passed down through whispered kitchens. If you fall asleep with bread under your pillow, you'll dream of the past. You smile. That's probably a crumb-related myth started by someone who fell asleep while eating, but still, you feel the loaf in your lap again. Warm, heavy, familiar. You close your eyes. Let the embers go out. Let the snow pile high. Let the bread crumble to silence. Let the story end slowly. And now, as the last flickers of firelight settle into glowing memory, you feel yourself begin to float. Not away, exactly, just gently down, like flower dust in morning light. Every thought loosens, softens, dissolves into the quiet between breaths.
Your muscles release, jaw unclenches, shoulders fall, hands open. You imagine lying on a bed of rye fields. The stalks sway just slightly in the breeze, brushing your skin with a rhythm as old as the earth. The scent is warm and grainy, with a hint of smoke and something sweet beneath. Honey or memory? In the distance, someone is baking. You can't see them, but you hear the whisper of kneading, the hum of a stone oven, a lullaby in the crackle of crust. It wraps around you, gentle, repetitive, kind. You know the sound. It's the sound of being cared for. You sink a little deeper. Now the world is just warmth and softness. The loaf beside you pulses gently with heat, like a quiet heart. It doesn't speak, but it remembers for you. Everything you need to know is already in the dough. You don't have to hold it anymore. Not tonight. Not now. You're safe here. You're home. You're loved. And as the world narrows into silence, let it all drift. Let the story slip back into the oven. Let your breath slow to match the rise and fall of bread. And sleep, sleep, sleep.